When deciding on a headphone amplifier, there's a lot of things which you might consider important. You might be looking for something as objectively transparent and neutral as possible, something a bit warmer, something that synergizes well with a particular headphone, or has a particular feature like input switching, crossfeed, or a high power output, for example. And there are a ton of products on the market to choose from affordable and compact amps that provide amazing bang for the buck, to high-end products that provide absolutely stunning sound quality and design. But it's pretty rare that you find something which ticks just about every box, and rarer still that you find something which does that and then goes 10 steps further. This is the Zahl HM1. This review is going to be a bit longer than usual because there is simply too much to talk about to fit into 10 minutes. So if you'd like to skip to a particular section, there are timestamp sections in the YouTube player and in the description. Let's start with the elephant in the room because it's quite a big elephant. This amp costs $8,000. And not only that, if you want one, you'll be waiting some time because there are only 50 of these being made each year, and this year's batch is already sold out. So if you do want one, it's going to test not only your wallet, but also your patience. But given as it is already sold out for this year, you might be wondering, why are people so happy to pay $8,000 for a headphone amp? And the first reason is simply the name. The HM1 is made by hand by Michael Zahl, who, if you're unfamiliar, has been designing and building analog gear, primarily mixing consoles, for over 35 years. His equipment's used by artists like Nils Fram, Aphex Twin, the Chemical Brothers, and it's also present in various well-known studios. In fact, all of the music that you'll hear throughout this video is exclusively by artists using Zahl gear. You can even see some older Zahl desks in places like the Rock and Pop Museum, and if you want a new one for yourself, the AM1 console will probably set you back around $100,000, depending on configuration. And there's a few design philosophy aspects from his other designs which are also present in the HM1. The first being that everything must be analog. Doesn't matter what it is, how difficult it would be to do in analog, or how simple it would be to do digitally, everything must be analog and everything must be linear. No high frequency switching components whatsoever. And the second aspect simply being no compromise. Do it properly and as well as can be done, not to a budget. But of course, the most important thing isn't who made it, it's what does it sound like and what can it do. So let's start by taking a look at the build and construction of the HM1. The amplifier comes in two units, one for the main amp itself and another smaller box which contains the transformer, with a switch on the front to adjust to any regional voltage in quite precise increments. And I say transformer, not power supply, because this isn't a full power supply. Rather than have the entire power supply either within the amp itself or in a separate box, which is what some designs do, the HM1 has an external transformer which steps down the mains voltage and feeds a low voltage AC to the amp, where it's then rectified to DC. This approach means that the transformer can be kept completely separate and physically distanced from the amp itself to avoid any kind of interference that the transformer being close might cause. But the capacitance, the energy storage, is all within the amplifier itself. Everything they've done here is to try and bring down the power supply impedance as much as possible whilst keeping that transformer separate. So that's a really cool way of doing things. But not only that, there are completely potential separated windings on the transformer for the left and right channels of the headphone amp and the preamp, and another completely potential separated winding just for the front panel indicators and logic circuitry, so that that doesn't share power at all with the main amplifier. The rectification from AC to DC, the filtering, and the voltage regulation are also completely separate for the left and right channels, so there's effectively 3 power supplies here. And now we come to the amplifier itself. Both units have a dark grey finish, which for the faceplates is a smooth, almost ceramic effect, and the main body has a subtle but welcome sparkle to it. The rear of the unit has 2 sets of inputs, each with a balanced and unbalanced option, and 2 outputs, one of which is a preamp output with balanced and XLR connections, and the other is an A through output over RCA. The A through output is tapped from input channel A after the input stage of the amp, so it's not wired in parallel to the actual inputs, but it's tapped before any volume control or sound adjustments, so it puts out exactly what is coming in. There is plenty of I/O here. The only slight gripe I have is that the left and right channel inputs are mirrored compared to most amps, so you do need to check that you are actually hooking it up correctly. And on the front, there is quite a bit more going on than you would see on a typical headphone amp, which is where we start to get into some of the unique features of the HM1. For connections, there's 4-pin XLR and 1/4-inch jack headphone outputs, and for volume control, we have not one, but 2 controls. Both inputs of the amplifier can be enabled or disabled independently using the buttons in the middle, and can also be mixed together with independent volume control, which for those using this in a production or a monitoring environment could certainly come in handy. And for me personally, as well as just using it to A/B and compare upstream products, I use it so that I can have my main music system playing into input A, bit perfect from Roon or HQ Player, whilst having my PC mix in audio from Discord voice chat, for example. Another little extra mile design aspect here is that as well as being able to control the inputs via the buttons, even if one is active, if you turn down the volume all the way, it will fully disconnect that signal path just to prevent any stray signal from coming through. And an extra mile design aspect within this is that the volume control itself is done via a logarithmic potentiometer, a very nice one from TKD. And the auto shutoff is done via a logic circuit, part of which is a linear potentiometer from TKD. Now, Michael didn't just put that linear potentiometer on the end, because that would just be too easy. Instead, he modifies the potentiometers to have the left and right balanced sections separate, and put the linear one physically in between the two, just for that extra bit of channel separation, because why not? Go the extra mile if you can. You can also adjust the left and right balance to correct for small imbalances in your room, system, or hearing, and then just below the volume we have 3 adjustments. The first 2 are analog bass and treble shelf EQs, which allow you to adjust things in up to 5 dB in either direction. You can see these on screen now, and I should note actually that I'm quite thankful that the bass shelf in particular doesn't extend too far. I find that some products with fixed EQ configurations have a bass setting that goes too far out past 100 Hz, and it starts to make things sound a bit bloated and muddy. This doesn't do that. That's nice. The EQ also seems to have almost no impact on sound quality whatsoever. Certain analog EQ products can have quite a drastic change on just distortion of stuff going through them. Whereas this, when you turn it on and adjust things, it was about a 2 dB change in Synad. So other than the intended change, they seem to be very transparent. It's almost like 35 years experience designing mixing desks and analog EQ circuits is showing here. Oh, and if you're not using the sound adjustments or want to enable and disable them with the press of a button, you can use the direct button underneath each input. This completely takes the sound adjustment circuitry out of the signal path, and you can apply it to either one input or both, or neither. EQ is certainly a nice feature to have, especially when it's at your fingertips like this. But what really steals the show for me is the adjustment on the right. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this was crossfeed, which is a feature that a lot of products, both analog and digital, do have. Now, crossfeed feeds some of the right channel signal into the left channel, but at a slight attenuation and with a bit of a delay. And the reason for this is to try and simulate the effect of listening to a pair of speakers rather than headphones. Because with speakers, each ear can hear both channels. It can hear the left and the right, but at slightly different levels and at slightly different times. Whereas with a headphone, each ear just hears the one channel. Now, I personally have never really been a fan of typical crossfeed. It's certainly a nice feature to have, and I get why people like it, but I've only really found myself wanting to use it on older tracks that have been hard panned, not produced with the intention of being played back on headphones. So they've got stuff directly off to the left or directly off to the right, and it can be a bit jarring. In those instances, crossfeed definitely helps to push things out in front of you and make things less jarring. But I never really found that it made things bigger, and a lot of tracks it can make them sound worse. But this is not crossfeed. It's quite a lot more clever than that. Firstly, it performs what's called a mid-side comparison, which looks at what content in the left and right audio signal is similar versus different, and it adjusts the amplitude of only the differences, which increases the stereo width. It makes it wider. And this is exactly how it's done in actual production. Then it applies some crossfeed, but not to the whole left and right channel, only to those differences. And there could be some other stuff going on as well, I actually don't know. But this multi-stage process leads to a really convincing effect, where instead of stuff just being pushed out in front of you or just made wider, the sound stage is just made bigger. And I don't just mean that this makes things sound diffused and area to try and create a sense of spaciousness. I mean, things can actually be quite a bit more clearly separated and physically distanced from other stuff in the mix than they were originally when using this. And all the while, centered stuff like vocals doesn't get touched. Imaging is laser precise the whole time, and it doesn't get smeared or muddied out at all, because crossfeed can sometimes have negative impacts on centered stuff. You can also go the other way and contract a song that's perhaps a bit too overly big and diffused and end up with a better result, or go all the way down to mono if you feel like it. This is not crossfeed, it's a soundstage knob and it works. But the soundstage knob is not something which you'd leave just on maximum the whole time to get the biggest possible stage. All of the adjustments on the HM1 are intended to slightly adjust how something has been mixed. The left and right balance adjusts in 0.2 dB increments, and the EQ only goes up to 5 dB because these are not meant to make massive changes. They're meant to nudge a mix closer to perfect, and the soundstage knob is no different. A lot of tracks, I'd say most, sound their best with just a little bit extra stage, a little bit clearer defined separation, and just keeping that adjustment on +1. Others sound their best if you tame them and reel them in a bit and put it on -1 or -2. But what really surprised me about this wasn't that you can just crank it to max and go, wow, soundstage, because it doesn't quite work that way. A, it's never going to take a regular song and make it sound enormous. It's a somewhat subtle, tasteful adjustment. But also, if you put a really well-mastered track, one that sounds quite big to begin with through it, and crank the soundstage knob to max, it sounds a bit weird. It doesn't just extend things infinitely. What surprised me about this was that for every single song that I listened to, every single one, doesn't matter what genre it is, there was one position on that dial which just sounded correct, which just sounded, this is how the song should have sounded originally. Oh yeah, and just as a reminder, all of this is being done entirely within the analog domain. No digital processing whatsoever. Synergy is something which gets talked about quite a bit in audio, and the adjustments here really do help the HM1 to synergize with pieces of music better and more flexibly than other devices. But it doesn't just stop there, because whilst a piece of music can be nudged in a particular direction to improve the mix, or just listen to as is if you feel that that's correct, or that the mixing and mastering is done perfectly to your tastes, but synergizing with your headphones is also important. Certain headphones sound their best on amps that are as neutral, clean, and resolving as possible. Others sound their best on amps that provide quite a bit of coloration, add some body and warmth, or provide some extra harmonic distortion that, was sure, not objectively correct, can make things more subjectively enjoyable. It can produce a more lush, warm timbre for instruments, for example. There's a reason why quite a lot of people love many tube amp designs that objectively aren't great, but color the sound in a way which a lot of people really enjoy. And in the category of solid-state amps, you've got designs which aim entirely for objective performance above all else, often with huge amounts of negative feedback error correction. But some say that these suffer in subjective sound quality and enjoyment as a result of that. Some take an approach that doesn't provide particularly great objective performance, but many subjectively prefer the sound of, some even going as far as to use no feedback at all. And some try to satisfy both camps, providing excellent objective performance whilst keeping aspects that are generally subjectively well-liked, like a discrete Class A design and a linear power supply. The HM1, I think, falls into this category. It's a fully discrete Class A design with a linear power supply, and it can comfortably pump out several watts continuously, with vanishingly low distortion. But it also gives you a choice. The HM1 has the option to run in Class A with a DC servo feedback system. Or you can turn this off and run it as a Class A zero feedback amp. With the feedback on, the HM1 is, to my ear, perfectly neutral, with no coloration whatsoever that I can detect, and the level of grip, control, and authority it has over even the most demanding headphones is close to unparalleled. If you'd like to see full measurements of this, by the way, they are available on the audiofiles section of headphones.com. And then when you turn the feedback off, you get a bit of added body and warmth, a little bit more meat on the bones to the presentation, and a slightly more intimate presentation in some cases. For certain headphones like the ZMF Atrium or the Sennheiser HD800S, the zero feedback mode just sounded better. And with headphones like the Susvara or the Final D8000 Pro, turning feedback on just bumped up the resolution, the speed and tactility of transients and impactful elements, and just fit better with those headphones. Similar to the soundstage adjustment, it wasn't a case of which setting is best, or which setting do I like more. It was simply a case of what setting works best with the particular music and headphones that I'm listening to in that moment. And having both of those modes at your fingertips is fantastic. You've kind of got two amps in one here. The flexibility of the HM1 and the ability to make small, well-implemented adjustments gives you the ability to take your music and your headphones and make them the best that they can be. But the features of this amp aren't the only reason that I love it so much. They're fantastic, sure, and I'd struggle to go back to not having them. but just listening to the HM1, as I would any other product with no signal path adjustments whatsoever, it's stellar. Would I pay the asking price just for this amplifier with none of its features? No. There's a lot about this which you can get from other amps, and diminishing returns are a thing. If you're wondering whether this sounds twice as good as most $2,000 or $3,000 amps, it doesn't work that way. But this is a little bit better in a lot of ways than even other really exceptional products, and most importantly, this is such a complete package. The HM1 has some seriously impressive speed and detail retrieval to it. The transient presentation on this is just phenomenal. Probably helped by the fact that the bandwidth on this extends over 500 kHz. It's a very high bandwidth amp, but it's got a soundstage which honestly is just limited by the transducers themselves, and what I really like about it is the fact that this is so explosively dynamic. I have not heard another amplifier which is as hard-hitting, fast, and controlled as the HM1 is, particularly with hard-to-drive headphones. The way that this is able to display percussion in particular is honestly quite unparalleled. And as a percussionist, that puts quite a big smile on my face. And in the no feedback mode, it gives me that slightly colored presentation, that slight added warmth and lushness, without sacrificing resolution and openness to the same degree that a lot of other warmer amps often do. In fact, even objectively speaking, the HM1 with no feedback performs better than any other no feedback headphone amp that I'm aware of. And when you throw all of those fantastic subjective sound quality aspects on top of the excellent objective performance, and then add in the ability to drive even the hardest to drive headphones far better than almost any other amplifier I've tried, and I'm really struggling to find something to complain about here. Other than that bit, that's yeah. There are two things that I can point to that could be improved though. The first is that if you're using very sensitive IEMs, you might be able to hear a slight noise floor. It's not high, it's within a few dB of a Korg Mojo 2, for example, so if you don't hear noise on that, you probably won't hear it on this. But if you are someone who uses extensively very sensitive IEMs, you probably want to go for an amplifier which has as low a noise floor as physically possible. Bigger, more powerful amps like this generally aren't the way to go. The other thing is that the HM1 is not a particularly high gain amplifier, and generally speaking, for a high impedance, low sensitivity headphone, you don't need much current, but you need a lot of voltage. And for a low impedance, low sensitivity headphone, you won't need that much voltage, but you need a lot more current. The HM1 has huge current capability, enough theoretically for up to 32 watts continuous at 32 ohms in fact, or more for short durations. But unlike most amps, the output is limited by voltage, not current. This means that for stereotypically hard to drive stuff like a Susvara, despite the only 3.5 watts at 32 ohms that the HM1 can do, it drives them amazingly. Because where most amps with low impedance loads are struggling for current, and even if they have a maximum output of 6 watts, they might be really struggling and distorting way more at 1 or 2 watts, the HM1 basically just does not change in performance depending on the load. You can put something really difficult on it, and it's pumping out 2 watts continuous and not breaking a sweat. So I found that this is one of, if not the very best amp for a lot of hard to drive planars, like the DCA Stealth, the Hyperman Susvara, and the Abyss 1266. But there are going to be some very high impedance, low sensitivity headphones that you might not actually be able to get loud enough just because the output voltage is the limitation there. I first heard the HM1 at Munich High End last year, and I was so impressed with it just at that show that I came home, immediately listed for sale what at the time were my 2 favorite amps, and placed an order. Many months down the line, and having now spent proper time with it with plenty of headphones, I am still just as impressed. The design of the HM1 goes beyond just not cutting corners. There are so many design aspects to this, which might make even just the tiniest improvements, and many aren't mentioned anywhere in any of the marketing or documentation for this product because they weren't done to become a marketing point. They were done because going the extra mile was a minimum, not a goal, and the results speak for themselves. Subjectively, this sounds phenomenal, and it left me wanting for nothing. Until I hear something better, I genuinely cannot think what I'd improve on over this. Combine that with some excellent objective performance and the ability to adjust sound in purposeful ways to make pretty much any combination of person, headphone, and music work together best, and what you get is one of the most complete and compromise-free headphone listening experiences possible. I hope you found that video interesting and useful. If you are interested in an HM1, They are available at headphones.com. And if you'd like to ask me or other Wiggly Air enthusiasts anything about music, gear, or any topic at all, come and say hello on the headphones.com Discord server or the headphones.com forum. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.